Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all to the witnesses for being here today and for the work you do on behalf of our country. We are very, very grateful. I've got three basic questions, and so I'm going to try to move through them quick so we can get to all of them. Administrator Long, I want to again thank you for being here today and also for briefing several senators on a call on September 28th in which you updated us on the U.S. government's relief efforts in Puerto Rico. On this call, you said that the airports and seaports were all heavily damaged. You also added that the road networks were in many cases impassable and that you lacked trucks and personnel to be able to effectively distribute the ample relief supplies you had waiting on pallets. So when did FEMA and the Department of Defense first make the assessment that the damage to the airports and seaports would encumber the delivery of relief supplies?
Almost immediately, and that was the logistical complexity of being able to put forward the humanitarian mission. All of those ports were damaged, but it wasn't just the ports, it was the air traffic control systems that also guide those in.
So it was almost immediate. So when did you make the determination that you would need the full capabilities of the United States military to be able to distribute resources based on that assessment? And when did you first ask the Department of Defense for the type of assets that were eventually provided for the relief response?
And if I may defer here, but let me be clear. We engaged the Department of Defense before Maria hit, and so there were a ton of assets on the island, before the storm hit. But you can only put so many people and equipment on an island, or you expose it to the storm, and it becomes useless after the fact. So it's a balancing game. But if I may defer.
Sure. Go ahead.
My name is Bob Saley.
Right.
As you may recall,
Make sure your microphone's on, please.
There it is. Sorry. Hurricane Irma came through first. As you know, it hit St. Thomas and St. John, did a lot of damage. We actually had DoD assets in the area. We had the USS.
So I'm just going to interrupt for a second, because on the September 28th call with FEMA and other agencies, the DoD representative stated that the U.S. Northern Command was working on a plan to mobilize an additional sustainment force to Puerto Rico. Now, that's 8 days after the hurricane hit. Additionally, according to FEMA's website, on October 1st, U.S. Northern Command delivered approximately 310,000 meals, 150,000 liters of water, generators, tarps, additional sustainment units, and leading components of aviation command and control. Given that it was apparent from FEMA and DoD assessment that both the airports and seaports of Puerto Rico were heavily damaged and that this would cause immense distribution challenges, why did it take until October 1st to deliver aviation command and control to the island? And why on September 28th was the U.S. Northern Command still working to finalize its plans to deliver a sustainment force? And when did the sustainment force arrive?
So, ma'am, to answer that question, again, there's concurrent activity always in these events. As I indicated, we had Navy ships in the area, the U.S. Kearsarge, the Oak Hill. They had helicopters. They were doing search and rescue capabilities. Simultaneously, U.S. Transcom, which is responsible for strategic airlift and providing C-17s and C-5s, was flying in assessment teams for airfields. As the administrator pointed out, a number of those airfields had severe damage, no navigation aids, no radars, those kinds of things. That equipment had to be put in place. All of this was happening well before the 28th, ma'am. I don't know where the impression got. There was
I'll tell you what, the impression came from the questions we asked on a conference call on September 28th. So what I would ask as a follow-up, we'll of course have these letters to you directly, is some real specifics here, because I think all of us were concerned that 8 days after the hurricane hit, it seemed like we were still having to suggest in that call that the United States military was going to be necessary to help get some supplies distributed because of the impassability of transportation infrastructure. I do, just because I have a couple of minutes left, want to move on to one other question to Administrator Long. Last week, ProPublica posted a story that stated that FEMA was declining to publicly release a document drafted several years ago that detailed how FEMA would respond to a major hurricane in Puerto Rico. According to ProPublica, FEMA started drafting the plans known as the Hurricane Annex after the lack of preparation in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. ProPublica also found similar plans posted on DoD's website for Hawaii, which detailed an 85-step process to restore electricity on Hawaii in the event of a hurricane. So why is FEMA not releasing this document to the public? And could you please commit to making it public? And if not, will you please articulate what was in the Hurricane Annex and what steps you followed in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria?
Sure, Senator. We gave it to the committee last night, apparently.
Okay.
I was just briefed, but I was unaware of the issue.
All right.
I'd be happy to follow up with you directly.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And in that case, I will also just, before yielding back the remainder of my time, let you all know that, well, actually, we have a minute. So instead of giving this to the record, I did want to touch on the U.S. Virgin Islands and where we are in terms of power restoration and tourism, because perhaps even more so than Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands economy fundamentally depends on the ability of the islands to host tourists from all over the world. The Virgin Islands suffered a direct hit from not only Hurricane Maria, but Hurricane Irma as well. These storms knocked out the power across these islands, and the islands cannot expect to begin to reestablish its tourism economy without the restoration of power, to say the least. Yet, after more than a month, the U.S. Virgin Islands report that less than a third of the territories have power up and running. So what steps are FEMA and DoD taking to restore full power to the U.S. Virgin Islands, and what is FEMA's current estimate of when 100% of the islands will have power?
Yep, so excellent point. You know, the Virgin Islands were hit equally as hard as Puerto Rico, and the bottom line is they're basically in the same approach, but there's two different approaches being taken to restore the power, as I understand it. So where we proactively push forward the Army Corps of Engineers in Puerto Rico, the power authority that represents the Virgin Islands is in control and conducting their own contracts and leading their power restoration. But if the last number I saw was that power should be restored by, December timeframe as well. But here again, that's just an estimate.
Okay. Well, thank you again for your participation. I appreciate it very much. And Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you.